Imagine watching a medieval execution where the condemned criminal is hanged. Their body goes limp, and the crowd begins to disperse, satisfied that justice has been served, only to discover hours later that the supposedly dead person has somehow survived their execution and is now sitting up in their coffin, gasping for air and asking for water. This wasn't a miracle or divine intervention, but a terrifying reality that occurred more frequently than medieval authorities wanted to admit, creating a legal and social nightmare that challenged everything people believed about justice, divine will, and the finality of death itself. What happened next to these living corpses who had cheated death reveals one of history's most disturbing examples of how legal systems could become so rigid and bureaucratic that they would rather torture survivors back to death than admit that their execution methods were fallible and that innocent people might have been wrongfully condemned. The phenomenon of execution survivors was far more common in medieval times than historical records suggest, largely because authorities worked systematically to suppress information about failed executions that might undermine public confidence in the justice system and raise uncomfortable questions about divine approval of their punishments. Hanging, the most common form of execution, was particularly prone to failure due to the crude techniques employed by medieval executioners who lacked the anatomical knowledge necessary to ensure quick death through neck breaking. Instead of the swift cervical fracture that would cause immediate death, many victims were slowly strangled over periods of 10 to 15 minutes, and the process could be interrupted by rope failure, scaffold collapse, or premature cutting down by sympathetic officials. Beheadings could fail when executioners missed their mark or used dull blades, leaving victims severely wounded but alive, while burning at the stake sometimes resulted in survivors who had been rescued by crowds or who had somehow escaped from their restraints before suffering fatal injuries. The legal confusion that surrounded execution survivors created unprecedented challenges for medieval legal systems that had no established procedures for dealing with criminals who had technically completed their court-ordered punishment but remained inconveniently alive. Most legal codes assumed that executions were final and irreversible, making no provision for cases where the condemned survived their punishment and continued to exist in a legal limbo between life and death. Some jurisdictions treated survival as evidence of divine intervention that required the immediate release and pardon of the survivor, while others insisted that the execution sentence remained valid until the criminal was actually dead, regardless of how many attempts were required. The most extreme authorities argued that execution survivors had forfeited their right to legal existence by being condemned to death, making them legally non-persons who could be killed at will without additional judicial proceedings. The religious interpretations of execution survival reveal how medieval Christianity struggled to reconcile failed executions with theological beliefs about divine justice and the relationship between earthly punishment and spiritual salvation. Church authorities developed competing theological frameworks to explain why God might allow condemned criminals to survive their executions, with some arguing that survival indicated divine mercy and the possibility of repentance, while others claimed that survival was actually evidence of demonic intervention designed to thwart divine justice. The most disturbing interpretation suggested that execution survivors had been rejected by both heaven and hell, making them supernatural entities that posed spiritual dangers to anyone who came into contact with them. These theological debates had real-world consequences for survivors, who might be treated as blessed saints deserving of protection, or as cursed beings who needed to be destroyed to protect the community from spiritual contamination. The social stigma attached to execution survivors was so severe that many found themselves completely excluded from normal human society, unable to find work, shelter, or even basic human contact from people who viewed them as walking reminders of their own mortality and the fallibility of human justice. Communities often treated survivors as ghosts or supernatural beings who had violated the natural order by refusing to stay dead, while families frequently disowned relatives who had survived execution rather than risk being associated with someone who existed in the limbo between life and death. The psychological trauma of surviving one's own execution, combined with the complete social rejection that followed, drove many survivors to madness or suicide, leading to the bitter irony that people who had cheated death often ended up dying anyway from the psychological and social consequences of their survival. The medical treatment available to execution survivors was extremely limited, as medieval physicians had little understanding of how to treat the complex injuries caused by failed executions, while many refused to provide care to individuals they viewed as legally dead or spiritually contaminated. Hanging survivors often suffered from severe neck injuries, brain damage from oxygen deprivation, and psychological trauma that manifested in various forms of mental illness. Those who survived failed beheadings faced massive blood loss, nerve damage, and disfiguring injuries that made normal social interaction impossible. Burning survivors dealt with extensive scarring, respiratory damage, and chronic pain that medieval medicine was completely unable to address effectively. The lack of adequate medical care meant that many execution survivors died slowly from their injuries, experiencing a prolonged and agonizing death that was often worse than the original execution would have been. The bureaucratic responses to execution survivors reveal how institutional thinking could become so rigid and self-protective that authorities would rather commit additional acts of cruelty than acknowledge the fallibility of their systems or the possibility that they had made mistakes. Some jurisdictions developed elaborate procedures for completing failed executions, with detailed protocols for determining whether the original sentence had been adequately fulfilled or whether additional measures were required to ensure the criminal's death. These procedures often involved subjecting survivors to additional torture or alternative execution methods, justified by the argument that the original sentence remained valid until properly carried out. The bureaucratic approach to execution survival transformed human beings into administrative problems that needed to be resolved through proper procedural compliance rather than moral consideration of their rights or welfare. The economic exploitation of execution survivors created a disturbing industry where people who had cheated death became commodities that could be bought, sold, and displayed for entertainment purposes. Traveling circuses and carnival operators would purchase or lease execution survivors from authorities, exhibiting them as curiosities and freaks who had experienced death and returned to tell about it. Some survivors were forced to perform dramatic reenactments of their executions for paying audiences, while others were displayed as living proof of various religious or philosophical beliefs about life, death, and divine intervention. The most successful survivor exhibitions could generate substantial revenue for their operators, creating financial incentives for keeping execution survivors alive and visible rather than allowing them to disappear into obscurity or death. The international variations in treatment of execution survivors reveal how different legal and cultural systems approach the problem of failed executions, with responses ranging from immediate pardons and compensation to renewed torture and eventual death. French authorities typically treated survival as evidence of divine intervention that required immediate clemency, while German states often insisted on completing the original execution through alternative methods. English law developed complex precedents that considered factors such as the method of execution, the nature of the original crime, and the circumstances of survival in determining the appropriate response. Italian city-states sometimes held public debates about the fate of execution survivors, with the outcome depending on popular opinion and political considerations rather than established legal principles. Spanish authorities often turned survival cases over to the Inquisition, treating them as supernatural events that required religious rather than secular judgment. The psychological profiles of execution survivors provide disturbing insights into the long-term effects of experiencing one's own death while remaining conscious and aware throughout the process. Many survivors reported persistent feelings of existing outside normal reality, as if they were observing life from the perspective of the dead rather than participating as living beings. Others developed elaborate philosophical or religious frameworks to explain their survival, sometimes becoming prophets or religious leaders who claimed special knowledge about death and the afterlife. The most psychologically damaged survivors often became obsessed with death and dying, compulsively seeking out dangerous situations or repeatedly attempting suicide in efforts to complete the process that had been interrupted by their survival. Some developed dissociative disorders that allowed them to mentally separate from their traumatic experiences, while others became completely unable to form normal human relationships due to their unique perspective on mortality and suffering. The documentation of execution survivor cases was often deliberately suppressed or destroyed by authorities who understood that public knowledge of failed executions could undermine confidence in the justice system and encourage resistance to legal authority. The surviving records suggest that execution failures occurred in perhaps 5 to 10% of all cases, though the actual numbers may have been much higher given the strong incentives for concealing such events. Official documents often described execution survivors using euphemistic language that obscured the reality of what had happened, while court records frequently omitted any mention of survival entirely. The systematic suppression of information about execution failures means that many survivor stories have been lost to history, making it impossible to fully understand the scope and frequency of this phenomenon or its impact on medieval society. The technological innovations that were developed specifically in response to execution failures demonstrate how the desire to ensure successful killings drove advances in execution technology and technique. Improved rope manufacturing created stronger hanging devices that were less likely to break during executions, while better scaffold design reduced the risk of mechanical failure that might allow survivors to escape death. More sophisticated execution protocols were developed to ensure that condemned criminals were actually dead before being removed from execution sites, including procedures for checking vital signs and confirming the absence of life. Some jurisdictions developed backup execution methods that could be implemented immediately if the primary method failed, ensuring that survivors would face immediate re-execution without the opportunity for legal appeals or public sympathy. The family dynamics surrounding execution survivors created complex emotional and legal situations that often tore apart relationships and social networks while raising profound questions about identity, belonging, and social obligation. Spouses of execution survivors faced the question of whether they were married to living people or to legally dead individuals who had no claim to property, inheritance, or social status. Children struggled with the psychological impact of having parents who had died and returned to life, while extended families had to decide whether to acknowledge and support relatives who existed in legal and social limbo. Many families chose to treat execution survivors as if they had actually died, holding funeral services and dividing their property while refusing to acknowledge their continued existence. The social death that accompanied survival often proved more devastating than physical death would have been. The underground networks that developed to support execution survivors reveal how some members of medieval society recognized the fundamental injustice of the situation and worked to provide assistance despite legal and social prohibitions against helping these legal non-persons. Secret organizations provided shelter, medical care, and new identities to execution survivors who were willing to abandon their former lives and relocate to distant regions where their histories were unknown. Some religious groups treated survival as evidence of divine mercy that required Christian charity and support, while political dissidents sometimes used execution survivor cases as propaganda tools to challenge the legitimacy of existing legal systems. These support networks operated in constant danger of persecution by authorities who viewed assistance to execution survivors as a form of obstruction of justice that undermined the finality and deterrent effect of capital punishment. The long-term social impact of execution survivor cases contributed to gradual changes in legal systems and execution procedures that reflected growing awareness of the problems created by failed capital punishment. The legal precedents established by survivor cases influenced the development of more sophisticated appeal processes, more rigorous standards for determining guilt, and more humane execution methods that were designed to minimize the risk of survival. The social disruption caused by survivor cases also contributed to broader questioning of capital punishment itself, as communities struggled with the moral and practical problems created by legal systems that treated human life as disposable while proving incapable of disposing of it efficiently and definitively. Perhaps most disturbing of all is how the treatment of execution survivors reveals the extraordinary capacity of legal and social institutions to dehumanize individuals when they become inconvenient to established systems and procedures. Rather than recognizing execution survivors as human beings who deserved compassion and support after experiencing unimaginable trauma, most medieval authorities treated them as administrative problems that needed to be resolved through proper application of bureaucratic procedures. The willingness to subject already traumatized individuals to additional torture and killing, rather than acknowledging the fallibility of human justice, demonstrates how institutional thinking can override basic moral considerations when systems become more important than the people they are supposed to serve. What do you think about this absolutely horrifying demonstration of how legal systems could treat human beings as administrative problems rather than recognizing their fundamental humanity and right to exist? Can you imagine the psychological horror of surviving your own execution only to discover that society refuses to acknowledge your right to continue living because it would be bureaucratically inconvenient? The fact that authorities would rather torture survivors back to death than admit the fallibility of their justice systems really makes you wonder about the capacity for institutional cruelty that exists when abstract procedures become more important than human life and dignity, doesn't it? Share your thoughts in the comments about how contemporary legal and institutional systems might be creating similar situations where individual human welfare is sacrificed to maintain systemic efficiency and authority. If you found this investigation into the fate of execution survivors as disturbing and relevant as I did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more shocking revelations about how institutional thinking can override basic human compassion when systems prioritize abstract goals over individual welfare. Ring that notification bell because our next deep dive will explore another historical example of how bureaucratic logic can justify unthinkable cruelty when human beings become inconvenient to established procedures. Trust me, these stories will change how you think about the relationship between institutional authority and human rights forever.